Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. Thanks for joining me in another episode of Keep It Real. So if you've been following the show for a while, you know that I like to have pretty simple strategies, ways that you could evaluate for your degree of health and fitness and even longevity. And then also strategies that you can do to help maintain those things. If you get a little off track and you find out that there's some signs that your health and fitness isn't what it should be, then there's some strategies to kind of get things back on track. And so there's an interesting study that totally fit this kind of category of simplicity that I wanted to share with you. Basically what they did is they wanted to evaluate a person's risk factor for a cardiovascular event, which is like a stroke or a heart attack. And they wanted to use a very, very simple, low-tech way of measuring. So they used push-ups. And this is the first time that I've ever read a study where they use push-ups to help indicate, a future cardiovascular event or a risk factor for a future cardiovascular event. But that's what they did. And here's what it came down to is that people, this is actually men only. So maybe it's a slight limitation to the study. It's only on men. It's on firefighters, which is interesting because that's obviously an active occupation. So these guys that were physically active on their job, and they were, let's call it middle-aged, and they evaluated their push-ups and did a few other very simple in-office procedures, but by and large the push-up was the kind of the key indication that they used. And here's what it came down to is if the men were able to do 40 or more push-ups, then they had a 96% decreased chance that they're going to have a cardiovascular event in the near future. It was about a 10-year study. Their risk factor for a cardiovascular event was 96% less compared to the group that can do only 10 push-ups or less. And then for everybody in between like 10 push-ups and 40 plus push-ups, the risk factor was kind of about in between. So the more push-ups that you can do, the greater the chance of having lower risk factor for a future cardiovascular event. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. It also, kind of brings into view the importance of maintaining musculoskeletal health. Oftentimes we talk about brain health. We've talked about, blood sugar regulation. We've talked about other ways to evaluate cardiovascular health and inflammation and how all these are super key to decrease your risk factor for these kind of cardiovascular issues. But push-ups, this is very interesting, but also reminded me of a study I read a few years ago. So anyhow, actually, before I get to that last study was published just recently in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the JAMA, and that was just published. So that's readily available if you want to read more about that. But it reminded me of a study that was done a few years ago that actually got quite a bit of press. It ended up on some news shows and stuff because it was pretty interesting. Also very, very simple. It was published in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology. And again, it was a very, very simple test that you can do at home. It's called the, very aptly named, the sit-down, stand-up test. And that's exactly what it is from a standing position, you squat all the way down until your butt hits the floor, and then you have to stand back up. And here's basically how the results went. That if you had to use 2 hands and 2 knees to either get down or to get back up, you had a 7 times risk factor chance of dying within the next 6 years. It was a 6-year study, and the people who had to use both hands and both knees had a 7 times risk factor for dying within a 6-year period. So that was fascinating. And the people who can squat down and stand up without touching their hands, knees, or elbows had a significant decrease of dying within those 6 years. So in other words, it was kind of an interesting little, very basic test for longevity. And this was done in the elderly population. I think the age it's been a few years, but it was, let's call it maybe 60 to 80, somewhere in there. So pretty interesting study, but even if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, try this test out. And it's a little harder than you might think. But here's the thing, is I don't want you to think like, oh my gosh, if you fail on these tests, if you can't do 40 plus push-ups if you're a male, or if you can't do this sit down, stand up test, like, oh my gosh, this means I'm gonna die pretty soon. I want this to be empowering information. I want this to put a fire under you and to go, okay, this is a risk factor. I'm not able to do these things. So what are the strategies for me to start to get better at this? And it's to improve your musculoskeletal fitness. Start doing more push-ups, start doing more squats, get a fitness trainer, and really let them know your objectives. Here's these, clinical tests that you can do at home, and just say, I want to get better at these, so help me become more physically fit. And we know that to become more physically fit, oftentimes we have to alter our diet. And so we spent lots of episodes talking about what kind of ways that we could help to make our body burn more fat so we can be leaner. And actually these things are definitely easier on a leaner body. So just some things to think about, 2 very, very simple at-home tests that you can do that were published in high quality journals. And the first study was on, I think, maybe over 1,500 males. And the second one was on both males and females. And I think it was a little over 2,000 people. So these are pretty good sample size, and very interesting information, very simple, but very telling. And so hopefully check those out, try it on yourself, see where you end up, and then to make sure and set forth on the strategies to help unwind those things if you have those risk factors for those issues. So hopefully you can do those things, and let us know how it goes. Until then, keep it real.